I want to thank, anyway, I want to thank all of you for coming here, the University of King's College and the Canadian Centre for Ethics and Public Affairs, and especially Gordon McCuitt and Ian Stewart, even more especially for scraping me off of Air Canada Jazz, where I flew sardine class, sitting adjacent to a very large hockey player. So it's a delight to be here, even though I feel wired up for an EKG rather than a speech. As Portnoy's doctor said at the end, let us begin. Now, if you want to look up something called the naturalistic fallacy, you'll find it in dictionaries or encyclopedias of philosophy. Its status is that of a mistake in logic. David Hume gave it its original formulation in his 1704 treatise, but it was given its current designation by the moral philosopher G.E. Moore in 1903. And basically what's said to be fallacious, a logical error, is the deduction of an ought statement from an is statement. These things belong to entirely different orders, and therefore prescription, how people ought to behave, can't logically follow from any description of how things are in the world. Or put another way, science is one thing, ethics is quite another. I don't have any contributions to make to any debate about logical inference, but I do want to talk about the naturalistic fallacy, both as an historical accomplishment, as a stipulation about social roles, and as a practical problem for many of the arguments we're currently having about scientific and technological policies in our society. Whatever problems some philosophers may have about the naturalistic fallacy, what's beyond doubt is its status as a social and cultural institution. It is an historically real and consequential sorting device in modern culture. What are the cultural conditions for the fallaciousness of moving from science to ethics? How has it come about that certain sorts of people count for us as is experts and other sorts of people count for us as ought experts? And what does this distinction between social roles and types of people mean for contemporary culture and for the political process that we're living with now? And finally, is there anything that can be done to address the problems brought about by this distinction? Now, one way of gaining entry to these nested issues is to ask what the public authority of scientists, that is to say our is experts, now consists in. And an obvious answer is that authority flows from expertise. Who knows more about heredity than a geneticist? Who knows more about rocks than a geologist? More about how your heart works than a cardiologist? Knowing more is associated with the power to do more. And even if the public don't care about the scope and depth of knowledge, that's not their business, they surely care quite a lot about technique and the capacity effectively to intervene to do things. So who would trust a car mechanic to fix their heart? A cardiologist to fix their car? Or a well-meaning friend who is ignorant of both hearts and cars to fix either? Power to act is seen to derive from the scope and quality of expert knowledge. So technical expertise is central to questions about the authority of knowledge and knowers in our sort of society, and there's no getting around that fact. But there's some difference between expertise as a feature of technical authority and expertise as a sufficient response to questions about authority. So I want to try to get clear with you about what's meant by the authority of scientific expertise. Second, I want to look at some problems attending distinctions between technical authority and moral authority. And lastly, I want to trace some moments in the historical career that have produced present-day thinking about the technical and the moral. Now, there are at least three problems involved in the notion that technical expertise alone offers us adequate basis for public trust. To start with, expertise cannot be known directly. Trust and expertise depends first upon locating that expertise. In the nature of things and in our sort of society, expertise is almost always external. That's to say, it belongs to someone else. And our problem as individuals is how to recognize it, access it, and mobilize it. The rationalist individualist tradition that we inherit from the 17th century philosopher John Locke insists that proper knowledge is knowledge whose warrants are wholly within one's own compass. We only really know what we see at first hand or what we can prove with our own minds. But the practical consequences of embracing this kind of individualism should be the recognition that we have scarcely any legitimate knowledge at all. I'd like to say none whatsoever, but that would take a bit longer to argue. So that almost all of our knowledge, at least I would want to say, is held by courtesy, through reliance upon others on the basis of authority and trust. I know that this particular cardiologist is a good one because I read it a while ago in Boston Magazine's article on good doctors. And I know that credentialed cardiologists are the sort of people to go to if I've got something wrong with my heart, on the basis of a diffuse range of trusted sources, from school teachers to colleagues to print and digital media to direct contact with general practitioners who refer me. Despite widespread current unease about a climate of mistrust in authenticated experts, the fact of the matter, I think, is that no society has ever reposed as much trust as ours in the power of expertise. That's one reason for the widespread identification of scientists with priests and magicians. The present-day problem, I think, is not mistrust in scientists, but rather a problem in deciding who the scientific experts really are. The second problem flows from this. In late modern society, technical expertise tends to speak with different voices. Increasingly so as expertise extends its reach into more and more areas of political, economic, and personal concern. Psychiatric expert witnesses war with each other in court. Geologists are at odds with each other about the proper way of storing high levels of radioactive waste. Biologists disagree in public about how much mercury your body can safely carry. And of course, you can pick whatever expert-endorsed regime you like if it comes to raising your kids, being irresistible to the opposite or same sex, or losing weight. But expert disagreement is both pervasive and consequential in just those areas where political decisions about what we should do are involved. Whether twice 2 equals 4 or whether DNA is the genetic substance are not currently questions in the political domain. But what should be done with radioactive waste and what counts as the correct diet for safe weight loss very much are in the political domain. When the expert communities themselves haven't come to any settled view about genuine expertise in this area, it's asking a lot of the public to do so. And that is one of the problems that I and others have with the idea of public understanding of science. In other words, communicating more and more science to the public as a way of dealing with these problems of mistrust. Thirdly, there is a point of principle. And here's the twist on the philosopher's sense of the naturalistic fallacy, involved in someone knowing more, which is a technical matter, to someone doing the right thing, which is a moral and political matter. As the American biologist David Starr Jordan once said, wisdom is knowing what to do next, skill is knowing how to do it. and virtue is doing it. Technical expertise, that's to say, is a necessary but not a sufficient condition for effective action to achieve the ends that you might wish and think to be good. The cardiologist has got to care about your heart as well as to know a lot about hearts. The geologist has to be acting in the public interest rather than trying to augment the bottom line of a property developer. The expert nutritionist has got to testify to what she believes to be the truth rather than attending to the profits of the beef packing industry. So, in order for trust in experts to have its practical grip, we have to be satisfied not just that certain individuals know more, but that they're well-intentioned. And that if we trust them, they will try their best to do the right thing, even if, just because they're human, they can't always bring about the right result. At a practical level, the evaluation of expertise contains within it a moral evaluation. Who are the experts such that we can trust them with their technical knowledge to do the right thing? Now, at one point in our culture, there was a robust response to that question. The scientist, or in past usage, the natural philosopher, was not just someone who knew more, but someone who was better than the common run of humanity or of scholars. And there were several reasons why this might be believed. But one derived from the object of scientific study, nature, conceived as God's second book, on an interpretive par with Holy Scripture, was a very different thing compared to nature understood as a chance concatenation of atoms. The first had the capacity to morally uplift those who studied it. The second didn't. In the 1770s, the English Unitarian chemist Joseph Priestley wrote that a philosopher, a scientist, ought to be something greater and better than another man. If the man of science was not already virtuous when he came to science, then, he said, the contemplation of the works of God should give sublimity to his virtue, should expand his benevolence, extinguish everything mean, base, and selfish in his nature. Now, if we find these sorts of sentiments ridiculous today, it's in part because our view of the object of scientific study, natural reality, has itself changed, courtesy of the achievements of scientists themselves, largely in the middle and later part of the 19th century. If we conceive the object of scientific study as a secularized nature, that nature now contains no moral lessons and has no capacity for moral uplift. In 1898, Leo Tolstoy's essay on modern science described what he called a strange misunderstanding that lay at the heart of modern culture. This is Tolstoy. A plain, reasonable man expects science to tell him how he ought to live, how to treat his family, his neighbors, and the men of other tribes, how to restrain his passions, what to believe in and what not to believe in, and much else. But what does our science say to him on these matters, Tolstoy? It triumphantly tells him how many million miles it is from the earth to the sun. But I don't want any of those things, says a plain, reasonable man. I want to know how to live. To which the modern scientist responds, in effect, that's not my business. Now, this response is entirely reasonable from a modern point of view. And in the view of many, it's just a necessary condition for the objectivity and the integrity of science. Science, to be science, can't deal with the intractable and irredeemably subjective ought, but exclusively with the potentially consensual and objective is, with fact and not with value. This self-serving, self-denying ordinance made science powerful, but at the risk of moral irrelevance. But it was a price that had to be paid. At any rate, that was the view of the great German sociologist Max Weber, writing his essay Science as a Vocation in 1918. This is Weber. Science once promised that it would show the path to God, the road to happiness or to virtue. But who, aside from certain big children who are indeed still to be found in the natural science departments, Weber said, who still believes that the findings of astronomy, biology, physics, or chemistry can teach us anything about the meaning of the world? During the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the technical experts of Western society reflectively and systematically disengaged their work from the moral domain. The object of their study didn't invite moralizing, and the conditions of internal consensus and external credibility made forays from is to ought, fraught with risk. Any slippage from the descriptive to the prescriptive wasn't just a naturalistic fallacy marked by the philosophers, but it was culturally and politically a bad idea. If such people as moral experts in modern society existed, you were not to find them in the laboratory or speaking from a scientific podium. This was, for example, Albert Einstein's opinion. This is Einstein. Knowledge of what is does not open the door directly to what should be. All scientific statements and laws have one characteristic in common: they are true or false, adequate or inadequate. Roughly speaking, our reaction to them is yes or no. For the scientist, again Einstein, there is only being, but no wishing, no valuing, no good, no evil, no goal. As long as we remain within the realm of science proper, we can never meet with a sentence of the type, "Thou shalt not lie." By the 1930s, professionalization and secularism had begun to characterize both the way in which scientists presented themselves to the world and the way their work was understood by academic outsiders. Science was becoming a decently paid and well-regarded, but still ordinary job rather than a calling. Scientists working in bureaucratized settings, those engaged in the making of profit and secular power especially, could no longer appear as wholly pure and might even now worry about maintaining a disengaged image. Although much mid-century academic commentary seems not to have noticed, the vast majority of American scientists by the 1930s and 1940s were not then engaged in institutions of higher education, doing pure research intended to advance knowledge for the sake of knowledge. They were working in industry and for governments. The majority of them were, although much academic commentary seems not to have noticed. Disinterestedness and its associated virtues are far easier to ascribe to the powerless than to the powerful and those working for powerful institutions. And through their increasing association with business and with the military after the Second World War, scientists were becoming increasingly familiar with the corridors of power. For example, by the early 1940s, many commentators were vigorously insisting that the scientist was morally quite an ordinary person. Take Robert Merton, the sociologist, writing in 1942. Merton's justification for a sociological approach included the view that, as he put it, a passion for knowledge, idle curiosity, altruistic concern with benefit to humanity, and a host of other special motives have been attributed to the scientist. But Merton concluded, the quest for distinctive motives appears to have been misdirected. There is, he says, no satisfactory evidence that scientists are recruited for the ranks of those who exhibit an unusual degree of moral integrity, or that the objectivity of scientific knowledge proceeds from the personal virtues of scientists. You could and should properly defer to scientists' technical expertise, but there was no reason for deference to scientists in any area outside their special technical expertise. For example, on matters of what ought to be done. By the post-World War II period, insistence on the moral ordinariness of the scientist had become an American cultural commonplace. So in 1950, a book called Science is a Sacred Cow argued that science should not be treated as a sacred cow, just as in 1965, Ralph Lapp's The New Priesthood warned against the dangerous mistake of treating scientists as priests. The author worried about what later came to be called by Habermas technocracy, while other writers took for granted that the legend of heroic virtuosity persisted in some quarters only to identify the myth makers not with practicing scientists, but with moralizing educationalists. And he warned the public against credulity. Scientists, they said, are very ordinary professional men, and all they know is their own trade, just like all other professional men. Nor are scientists, it was said, better than anyone else at predicting an inherently unpredictable future, even when they forecast the future course of science and technology. Percy Bridgman took this view, the Harvard physicist. Knowing more science never means knowing much, if anything, about its future course of development. And this is really relevant to discussions of social responsibility, because much insistence, post-World War II insistence, that the scientists be socially responsible meant that the scientists could envisage what the future would be, the future course of science and technology. In 1964, Jacques Barzun's wonderful book, Science, the Glorious Entertainment, pointed to the loss of integrity and freedom associated with the scientist becoming the servant of the state and, as he said, the darling of industry. The old cosmopolitan loyalties to the free republic of science had been replaced by local loyalties to governments or to corporations. In the same vein, at this time, sociologists wrote that today the man of science has become a hireling, a willing subject in the service of the nation state. Now, this is not just external commentary. Many scientists themselves have very vigorously insisted on their collective moral ordinariness, warning the public for that reason against excessive trust in science. In 1963, the biologist Erwin Chargaff composed a sour modern dialogue in which an idealistic old chemist, Chargaff himself, was lectured by a trendily ambitious young molecular biologist. You seem, the young man sneered, to have the romantically foolish idea that only a good man can be a good scientist. The old chemist conceded the charge, but not its foolishness. For some biologists, the rise of big science and the associated industrialization of research were the decisive events compromising any notion of distinctive scientific virtue. So here is the biologist Paul Weiss writing in Science magazine and doing a bit of history of science. Throughout the phase of history which we have come to survey, and that was the last 3 centuries, till very recently, to be a scientist was not a job, but a calling. The scene, however, is now rapidly changing. The popularity and needs of an expanding science bring in more drifters and followers than pioneers. Shall we let brain power be overgrown by manpower and mechanical rote performance? The appearance of James Watson's smash hit account of the discovery of the double helix in 1968 was both an indicator and a further cause of these gathering shifts in sensibility. From the distance of over 38 years, it's not easy to recall the shock value of Watson's revelation that scientists might be motivated by the same sorts of concerns as anyone else. Chargaff wrote that the belief that the scientific profession was a noble one was certainly shattered in 1945, and for the bomb builders of the Manhattan Project, the stipulation of moral ordinariness had special significance. It was a way of laying the specter of Dr. Frankenstein. The idea that these appalling weapons have been brought into the world by bad people, badly motivated. Writing in 1960, C.P. Snow and Not in the Two Cultures insisted upon moral ordinariness as a way of showing the public that there was no reason to be frightened of scientists. that scientists were certainly not morally or temperamentally worse than other men. J. Robert Oppenheimer recognized but gently rejected traditional views of the moral superiority of the scientist. The study of physics, this is Oppenheimer, and I think my colleagues in the other sciences will let me speak for them too, does not make philosopher kings. It has not until now made kings. It almost never makes fit philosophers, so rarely that they must be counted as exceptions. I think one exception might have been Oppenheimer. Just before his death, Oppenheimer drew a measured but sharp distinction between the vast technical knowledge that scientists possessed and the moral and political programs of action in which scientific and technological knowledge was being increasingly enlisted. This is Oppenheimer. Among the things of which we cannot talk without some ambiguity, and in which the objective structure of the sciences will play what is often a very minor part, but sometimes an essential one, are many questions which are not private, which are common questions and public ones. The arts, the good life, the good society. There is, to my view, no reason why we scientists should come to these with a greater consensus or a greater sense of valid, relevant experience than any other profession. By the late 1960s, the socially concerned physicist Ralph Lapp thought it important to tell the public that scientists as a group probably have no better sense of human values than any other group. To say that science seeks the truth does not endow scientists as a group with special wisdom of what is good for society. Furthermore, scientists have no single community within which there is a common set of values. So it follows from this and from very many other statements by scientists themselves that there would be no reason to pay any special attention to scientists' views on what ought to be done, which was Tolstoy's important question. Certainly on matters which did not involve their special technical expertise, and even when such decisions implicated technical expertise which scientists alone possessed. So to put it briefly, expertise was increasingly viewed as not fungible. It didn't translate from one technical domain to another technical domain, much less from a technical domain to a moral or political domain. The advisory role of the scientists to the national security state represented a new form of technical power and authority, but the Oppenheimer security hearings of 1954 and the later McCarthyite persecutions soon offered dramatic lessons in the limits of that power. The state would continue to enlist scientific expertise and to grant considerable autonomy and vast resources to those experts, but only on the condition that the experts left whatever moral and political preferences they might have outside the doors to the corridors of power. Better yet, they should learn that they had no entitlement to expressions of special moral authority or political judgment. Should they insist on such authority, they risked losing access to the enormous material support that was being offered to scientists in the post-war decades. After the Oppenheimer hearings, the board reminded the American scientific community of the boundaries that democratic society placed around technical expertise. This is the board's judgment. A question can properly be raised about advice of specialists relating to moral, military, and political issues under circumstances which lend such advice an undue and in some cases decisive weight. Caution must be expressed with respect to judgments which go beyond areas of special and particular competence. So the state would be interested in scientific judgment within and only within those areas of special competence and no further. Shortly afterwards, a commentator on the Oppenheimer hearings noted they, the security board, didn't care what Oppenheimer's moral scruples were. It was the fact that he had any at all. which was the problem. And so the board's final report announced, we know that scientists with their unusual talents are loyal citizens and for every pertinent purpose, normal human beings. And that was probably meant as a warning as much as a description. The is-ought distinction, that is to say, was to be institutionalized in the modern scientific role as a condition of its political legitimacy. And it was a contract that appealed to both parties. The political powers got expertise on tap without interference in their political prerogatives. The scientists got money and a reconfigured but still worthwhile version of autonomy, as, for example, in the peer review system. Now, if the transition from knowing more to knowing what is the right thing to do is understood, as it is in the naturalistic fallacy, as a move within distinct languages or from one distinct language to another, and if our technical experts are considered to be no better than anyone else, then there's no basis for granting them any special moral authority. What I've tried to do briefly is to trace the historical development of just such beliefs, the result of which is a bias of technical experts now to avoid debates over morality and policy, and of moralists and policymakers to mistrust those technical experts who may still assert their special authority to make judgments about what we ought to do. This state of affairs is increasingly taken as a matter of course in late modern society. How could it be otherwise? It would be very foolish, I'm sure, not to concede major rights and authority to relevant technical experts, especially insofar as the knowledge implicated in such decisions becomes more and more complex, arcane, and ultimately opaque to all but a few. Moreover, there are some seldom acknowledged problems attending the attributed moral ordinariness of technical experts, and I want finally to turn to these problems. Skepticism is very cheap to express, but it's often very expensive in its consequences. If technical experts have no more moral right to be trusted than anyone else, then it follows that two things have to be done. First, we have to design instruments of surveillance and control designed to achieve what personal integrity is now supposed impotent to assure. Government bureaus of research integrity, conflict of interest offices, requirements for declarations of financial interest in scientific journals, and of course, informed consent regulations and institutional review boards. We have all of these things. And given the way that we live now, it would be unwise not to implement those measures. And they probably have at least some of their desired effects. But it would also be foolish to think that surveillance can ever be total, and therefore that the limitation of trust can ever approach the elimination of trust. External control and internal integrity have, for that reason, always to work together. Yet, as sociologists well understand, there is a tendency for people who are mistrusted to live down to expectations. Secondly, if our experts are presumed to lack integrity and moral authority, we have to put in place people specially trained to evaluate moral options and to advise on or to make moral decisions. The spectacular rise of professional ethicists and assorted moral experts is indeed a remarkable feature of recent times, and it is at once an expression of conviction in the moral ordinariness, or worse, of technical experts, and the withdrawal of trust in scientists and physicians to do the right thing. But it is, in my view, a delusion to suppose that morality can be simply and effectively offloaded to a cadre of experts. even if one accepts the very idea of superior professional moral expertise, the problems of locating such moral expertise and trusting it are very much the same as those sketched in the case of technical expertise. How do you recognize genuine moral experts? Now, this objection is not pedantry. Many bio and medical ethics centers now depend massively upon funding from the pharmaceutical industry. And in the U.S., the further turn of the skeptical wheel began long ago. Who watches the watchman? The regress is potentially infinite, and the intellectual, economic, and moral costs of traveling very far along that road are massive, crippling, and deeply unpleasant. Skepticism tends too easily to spread beyond the bounds within which one might like to keep it. Late modern society, our society, has indeed traveled the skeptical road, but it has not gone as far as some commentators suppose. For an indicator of the extent to which a trust society has not yet been dissolved and to which technical experts are held to higher than ordinary standards of conduct, look no further than the extent to which both the public and many of our experts respond to occasions of scientists' materialism, malfeasance, corruption, and insensitivity with displays of shock and dismay. Again, as sociologists know very well, moral outrage is a pretty good sign that an offense has been committed against what a society holds dear. The demoralization of technical expertise is far from complete. A trust society is very far from having been dissolved. There is, I think, an almost inverse relationship between the ease of taking measures to cope with the alleged demoralization of science and the likelihood that these measures will work. The current vogue for professionalizing and calling on ethical expertise is, in my view, unlikely to be very effective. It's relatively cheap. It gives the public an impression of doing something, but solid evidence of its utility is lacking. At the other extreme, if indeed the demoralization of science proceeds from some such large-scale social and cultural changes as secularization and professionalization, the possibilities of positive action in these matters are slim to nil. In pronouncing the disenchantment of nature at the beginning of the 20th century, Max Weber described the conditions in which scientists could no longer be priests, moralists, or even morally uplifted by their work. Few present-day scientists would want to unwind that bit of history, but no one can now be unconscious of the extent to which announcements of the death of the sacred were premature. Christian, Islamic, and Jewish fundamentalism have taken care of that. Neither is the 20th century professionalization of the scientific career and the transformation of science from a calling to a job a change that anyone could undo, or that anyone who enjoys the fruits of big science-produced technology and medicine would want to undo. But between the ineffectively easy and the impossibly visionary, there are, I think, real opportunities for addressing the corrosive growth of public mistrust. One such possibility is now being canvassed in various forms by many scientists and physicians and medical journal editors themselves. The commercialization of late modern science is pervasive, but academic science without large-scale commercial sponsorship or links is not inconceivable. Many areas of contemporary academic science continue to do their work totally or largely free of commercial subvention, and even while academic scientists are continually pressed to make their research pay and to seek out commercial sponsorship, governments, even now, accept some responsibility for picking up the tab for basic research when industry can't or won't. If one needs to put it this way, the independence of science, as well as its commercialization, has got cash value. If science comes to lose its public credibility, it loses everything, including its utility to industry. Finally, the obverse of scientists living down to expectations that they will do whatever they can get away with is the possibility that they will live up to a renewed presumption that they are honest, disinterested, and incorruptible. So it would be good for scientists themselves to express greater outrage when commerce corrodes disinterestedness, to accept whatever shrinkage in their resources might come from the limitation of compromising commercial ties, and to speak more openly and less embarrassedly in front of their colleagues and their students about science as a calling. I'd be happy to trust such scientists to use their expertise disinterestedly, because their moral authority would be everything that's possible for late modern technical experts. Thank you. Another thing I might do is be fallacious. I feel the question that you're asking is immensely important. I don't, since I was making the point that we don't presume expertise to be fungible, I don't think that my expertise is fungible in this area. I know perfectly well the kinds of debates you're talking about. I'm not sure how anything that I had to say bore upon it. I don't think, for example, to say that a cardiologist has to care about your heart as well as to know about hearts does not translate into the distribution of resources for expert inquiry to produce global equity. I have nothing to say about that, except that if scientists, agricultural development experts, or what have you, really wish to produce benefit for global communities, they would certainly be well advised not simply to deploy the expertise from the laboratory to the field, but to listen to what a range of people want and what their concerns are. But I really just don't feel competent to address that. And I certainly don't think that the good intentioned expert necessarily is part of an institution which is geared up to deliver global equity. I mean, for that, I think we simply have to do politics at the level of politics. That is correct.
Because who do we trust? Do we trust the person and how they're using their knowledge or the knowledge they're presenting to us? Because we are all trusting that, or most of us who are not anti-realists are trusting that electrons are real. The chemists believe in it. The biologists believe in it. We're trusting in Planck's constant, for example, the uncertainty principle, and that's the science is. As opposed to
Yeah, no, I don't think you missed very much, but you missed something, and that's my fault. It went by rather quickly. We do trust that DNA is the genetic substance. The question of whether we trust Planck's constant is interesting. I would dare say most of us don't know what it is. But we've all gone through school, and school science is tremendously effective at conveying a view of solidity and consensus. One of the great things about school science, and especially I think of physics and mathematics compared, for example, to school history or sociology or literature, is it can very effectively tell you you're wrong. So we have an institutional means for developing a very high degree of trust in scientific knowledge. Now, the reason I don't find that terribly interesting is all the science and technology that we read about in the papers or hear on the radio or internet, and which comes before our decision-making institutions for adjudication, is not science of that kind. It is science in which different experts speak with different voices, and that's the nature of it. It's not bad science. It's science at the cutting edge. It's public science. It's science in which the ship is not completely in the bottle, in which different interests may be in play, in which the phenomena are complex. Now, in those situations, trusting scientists and deciding which scientists to trust is unavoidable in a way that it isn't in school science. So I think that is a point that I'm glad I had an opportunity to say a bit more about. And if we allow public science, science at the research edge, science with a public and policy dimension to be modeled on school science, we're doing a disservice both to the scientific community and to the political process. And I'm afraid we have allowed that to happen. You'll hear from Professor Jasanoff later in the series about the different epistemologies, conceptions of method that are engaged when scientists give expert testimony in courts of law. And that would be an opportunity, I think, for many people here to address those sorts of questions. But briefly, in conclusion, I think it's right to address trust in scientists because all of the stuff that we have to make decisions about, at the same time we have to make decisions about which scientists to trust, if any.
I'm not sure this mic is working properly, so maybe I should speak up a little bit. I am in this discussion not quite clear from where you expect scientists to derive his moral principles. I very much like your historical review that has led to the discreditation of scientists' moral integrity, which undoubtedly is evident in many cases. But I do wonder if in your review, historical review, you have also studied scientists who have demonstrated a great deal of moral integrity. For example, you mentioned Einstein. I can think of a scientist like Max Planck, who is an eminent physicist, but has shown a great deal of moral integrity in his relationship with Einstein and his actions that he took towards promoting Einstein as a scientific peer. And also in many other ways of his life, he has shown a great deal of moral integrity. Just those kinds of examples where scientists have shown moral integrity, and you study them to find out from where did really their moral principles stem. Did they stem from their scientific reasoning, or did they stem also from the fact that they did not only base their actions and did not only derive their moral principles from science, from scientific reasoning, but also from revelation? I think it is well known that, for example, Planck was until the
I've been asked to repeat questions. So, if I didn't do violence to your detailed, at least three-part question, I think you're asking two things. One is, do I have anything to say about the sources of the moral fiber, if you like, that is indeed manifest in the scientists that you're talking about? I might ask you to move into the present and cite me examples, but the other question was whether I had any recommendations about how scientists could, in some non-visionary, non-utopian, but I think useful way, restore themselves in their calling to a sense of virtue. I don't have anything terribly interesting. I, from what I know of the people that you talked about and others, I don't see moral vision being deduced from scientific knowledge or from scientific method at all. I see over the course of history a lot of visionary programs for social reform being deductions from ideas of scientific method, but that's not what you're talking about with Einstein. I don't think Einstein ever in his life offered an opinion that he was deducing his views about world government or pacifism from special or general relativity or the photoelectric effect. So I think the answer to that question has got to be through the person of Einstein, Max Planck, Niels Bohr, Oppenheimer, and any number of people that you'd like to name. Now, when it comes, I think, to the other question, because I really dislike people, and I hope I'm not one of them, to say we must. You know, when people say we must, without supplying some mechanism, I tend to reach for my water pistol, if not my revolver. And it is true. You know, when I say scientists ought to take a look at what's happening in their community and take steps to restore their activity as a calling rather than as a job, with all the moral constitution that is reasonable for us to expect of technical experts. It is a good question. How do I suggest one should do that? Now, one thing I mentioned, when scientists, and I am very impressed myself with the role of the medical journal editors in the current contretemps over bias and commercial interest. They've got themselves together and they say, look, this will not do. We are compromising the integrity of the community, and we as journal editors are going to put measures in place to try to limit these sorts of biasing activities. Another thing that happens that one would like to see more of, one would like to see scientists in public expressing more outrage and more upset when these things happen. A lot of people who are very critical of the commercialization of science, and I have to say I am not one of the extreme ones. I have a lot to say in favor of ties between industry and academia. But a lot of people who are against the commercialization of science see this as an inherently biasing effect. I do not. I think plenty of things that happen wholly within the ivory tower of modern universities are as troubling as things that happen in the relations between universities and industry. But when things happen which are demonstrably inexcusable, the ghostwriting of papers that David Healy has identified and complained about, the sacking of people who produce findings inconvenient to big pharma companies, when these things happen, I want to see more relevant scientists expressing their sense that this is unacceptable. Many do now. And if this happens, if more of them say, we'll draw a line, this is unacceptable, then this is a way of restoring science to whatever virtue it can reasonably expect. And I would also like to see scientists, and here I include myself, academics in general, in our professional, in our big science or big history of science or big sociology world, talking more, less about career prospects and more about problems and the excitement of getting stuck into a problem and solving a problem. We tend to be somehow embarrassed in talking in front of colleagues and students in this way, and my recommendation is that I know plenty of colleagues who are as cold to engagement with their problems and are as motivated by the desire to solve this problem, whether it's scientific or historical, as anyone else. But somehow we've lost the knack of talking like this in public. We talk cynically about what sells. We talk about what's likely to get you a job. We talk about what's likely to get published. I think we have got enough people, quite a lot of people, who are not actually motivated in these careerist ways, and I would simply like to encourage them to talk in public more in the idiom that actually inspires them. So I think these are reasonable things to ask to do. They're not, snapping your fingers and solving the problem, but I think we've got a very complex set of problems to solve, and it would be wrong to identify a simple solution to these problems.
This microphone, because I was looking at who came up first, all right?
Okay, I'll come to the microphone even though it doesn't work. I'd like to, without at all wanting to disagree with this idea of awakening a sense of integrity in science in a way that you just expressed it so lovely right now, I'd like to challenge it a little bit on an argument you made on the way to get there. And challenge on it because I hear it many times in many places from researchers, from traditions, and it's always puzzled me. And the argument is this one about people behaving down to expectations. So if you regulate us, that means you don't trust us. And I find it very interesting who makes that argument, who doesn't, who gets to make that argument, and who doesn't. Because as a citizen in my country, there are laws against murder. I don't behave down to them, and I don't think my government distrusts me from making them. So I've never understood why it is taken in this personal sense that someone mistrusts me, and this is why, or someone mistrusts people like me, and this is why they're making external regulation, because they don't trust my internal integrity. So I'd love to hear your question.
Yeah, clearly, you're absolutely right. This is not a global argument. As you said, the extreme example of laws against murder don't, to any conceivable extent, produce more murder. The remark is founded on a fairly large body of research which doesn't deal with murder, but as many in the room will probably know, school teachers told that the students that they're about to teach in their class are of a certain intellectual level, and they don't perform very well. And then with a control group of the same IQ or whatever you want to do, the teacher's being told that the students are rather clever and they do rather well. That's the sort of thing I have in mind. You prompt me to make a distinction between your example and the examples that I just posed. And I think the instance of scientific integrity is closer to the school teacher example than to the murder example. I can think of many reasons why people don't commit murder, apart from the fact that, apart from the legal and penal environment with which it's surrounded. In other words, their sense that it's wrong.
Take less explanatory examples, and your body of research is about children, not adults. Gun control or laws about financial fiduciaries or
Accepted.
We have to go fast questions.
Even fast ones. You mentioned in your conclusion and in your response to some of the other questions that it would be of value to the science community to try to preserve its integrity. Just investing in the university context of corporate sponsorships and all that. And I guess I feel like I'm missing something here because I'm wondering what it would actually look like for the scientific community to lose credibility in the public eye. I just can't imagine a Luddite with an eyeball. What would that? What effect would that have? What would that actually look like? Or am I not seeing?
Yeah, I think the question is what would it look like for the public to lose faith in the scientific community. I think there is a sense in which the limiting case of saying we mistrust scientists is, strictly speaking, inconceivable given a society that looks anything like ours. For example, to mistrust one scientific claim, you find yourself having to trust some other scientific claim. So I think there's a sense of, if I can use the word, transcendental trust, which is just the basis for local skepticism. You can't disbelieve everything. So let's just assume that nothing I said bears upon the possibility of a global loss of trust in science. I think that's unintelligible in our society. Is it possible to lose trust in the integrity of physicians conducting phase 3 clinical trials? Yes, of course it is. You can, in other words, suspect that individuals conducting these trials might have a financial interest in the drug or device being tested and decide not to enroll in them. That doesn't involve a global loss of trust. That involves a great deal of trust in what you've heard from whistleblowing scientists and from the medical journals and other places. So let's simply rule out as unintelligible losing trust in science, but let us consider as wholly intelligible losing trust locally in a series of scientific practices and a series of scientific specialists. I think that's wholly intelligible.
We have only 5 minutes left, so I'm going to drop the guillotine at that time. So I have a comment rather than a question. I just wanted to say that although scientists as individuals are fallible and are correctable, science itself is not amoral or valueless, because the greatest value that's important to science is truth. And the pursuit of truth, somehow it's interesting, I don't know how to explain it logically, but the absolute devotion to truth leads to some other values that we respect and that we cherish. For example, I'm a happy mathematician, and I know cases where a mathematician of some stature could steal the work of a colleague or a student, and the student goes to our colleague, young colleague, goes and talks to the mathematician, senior guy, explains his ideas, but there's a certain trust there, and I have seen many examples where the senior person gives absolute credit to the younger, to that strong person. And this is a value that seems to be derived from the respect for truth. And we can go very far away. I don't know if you know this or not. The case of, for instance, Gregory Shapin,
Yes.
the guy who proved the phone-correct rejection. He was offered a Clay prize of $1 million. He was offered the Phoenix Medal, but he turned them down both because he said, all that matters to me is whether what I've done is correct, whether it's true or not. Once I know it's true, that's all that matters. I don't give a damn what people say.
No, as you say, that's a comment rather than a question, and his reward was in the New Yorker. No, I'm